You're stealing my baby. Are you serious right now? Give me my baby back. The woman's voice cracked, raw with panic and desperation as she reached out, but the officer didn't flinch. He held the newborn close to his chest, his face cold, unyielding. The hospital hallway echoed with her cries, her trembling hands clutching at nothing but air as the officer took another step back. Ma'am, step away. This child is not yours. His words cut through the air like a knife, sharp and deliberate. Her knees nearly buckled. Not mine. What are you talking about? I just gave birth to him. He's mine, look at him. Look at me. Her voice rose, but the officer's eyes didn't soften. Instead, he turned his back and started walking, the baby still swaddled tightly in the blue hospital blanket. Stop. She lunged forward, only to be blocked by another officer. Please. He's my son. Somebody stop him. But no one did. Nurses exchanged nervous glances, doctors whispered, but nobody stepped in. You're making a scene, ma'am. Back away now or I'll have to place you under arrest. Her breath hitched. Arrest? For trying to hold her own child. Her hands trembled as she reached into her hospital gown, pulling out the ID band still strapped to her wrist, the same band that matched the one around the baby's tiny ankle. Look. Look at this. It's proof. He's mine. The officer barely glanced at it before shaking his head. That doesn't mean anything. Anyone could have put that on. Tears blurred her vision, but the anger burned hotter than the fear. You can't do this. You can't just take him. I can, and I will. And then he walked away. The woman's scream shattered the silence as her legs gave out, collapsing onto the cold tile floor. The officer disappeared around the corner, leaving her sobbing in front of an audience too scared, or too indifferent, to intervene. But what he didn't know was that her husband was already on his way. And he wasn't just any man, he was the chief of the FBI. The phone call had been brief but explosive. He had only caught fragments between her sobs. The baby, he took him, they're saying he's not ours. But it was enough. Within seconds, he was out the door. When he arrived at the hospital, the scene he walked into was chaos. His wife was still on the floor, surrounded by nurses who were doing more to calm her down than to get her son back. He didn't stop to ask questions. He didn't waste time with formalities. His badge was out before anyone could blink, his voice cutting through the noise like thunder. Where is he? The staff hesitated. Where is he? And that's when he saw it, the officer, standing at the far end of the hallway, still holding the baby. Time seemed to stop as their eyes locked. The officer straightened, his grip on the child tightening. For a moment, no one moved. Then the chief started walking. With every step, the tension grew thicker. The officer's eyes darted, searching for an escape, but there was none. Put the baby down. Sir, now. The officer flinched, but he didn't let go. Instead, his fingers twitched toward the holster on his belt. The chief's voice dropped, low and lethal. I wouldn't do that if I were you. And that's when the room seemed to tilt. Nurses gasped. Security guards stepped closer. The officer's hand froze inches from his weapon. The chief took another step. This isn't just kidnapping. This is a federal offense. Do you have any idea what you've just done? The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. Put the baby down. Or so help me, you'll regret this for the rest of your life. For the first time, the officer's confidence cracked. His fingers loosened just enough for the chief to close the distance and snatched the baby out of his arms. The woman's cry of relief echoed down the hall as she scrambled to her feet, holding her child like she'd never let go again. But the chief wasn't finished. He turned back to the officer, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. You're done. Badge. Gun. Now. The officer hesitated. Now. And then it was over. Or so it seemed. Because what started as an act of blatant racism was about to unravel into something far darker, something that went beyond one officer and one child. What if this wasn't the first time he had done this? What if this officer wasn't acting alone? And what if the truth about what really happened that day was only the beginning of a much bigger conspiracy, one that would expose secrets buried deep within the system? Stay with us, because this story is just getting started. And by the end, you won't believe what happens next. Hello, and welcome to Plow of Twist. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say something important. Here, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. We believe in equality, respect, and dignity for all people, regardless of race, background, or identity. This story, like many others we share, sheds light on the struggles faced by so many and highlights the importance of standing up for what is right. We appreciate you for being here, and we hope this story resonates with you. If you enjoy impactful and thought-provoking narratives, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to support us. Now, sit back, and let's jump into an unforgettable story. Enjoy. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and anxiety. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, washing the pale walls in a sterile glow. Nurses in pastel scrubs moved swiftly, their shoes squeaking against polished floors. Somewhere in the distance, a baby cried. But here, in this quiet corner of the maternity ward, it was silent, too silent. The tension hung thick in the air, heavier than the sound of footsteps or the faint beeping of monitors. It was the kind of silence that felt dangerous, like the calm before a storm. The woman sitting on the hospital bed, cradling her newborn, looked exhausted but radiant. Her name was Naomi Brooks. Her skin, the color of warm mahogany, glistened with a slight sheen of sweat. Her hair was still damp, braided tightly to keep it out of her face during labor, and her brown eyes shimmered with tears, of joy, of relief, of love so overwhelming it almost hurt. She'd waited for this moment for months, dreamed of it, worried about it. And now, it was real. She looked down at the baby swaddled in her arms, barely able to believe he was hers. His tiny fingers twitched in his sleep, his chest rising and falling with soft, rhythmic breaths. He had her nose, her full lips. Her heart swelled with pride, but even as she smiled, there was an undercurrent of fear she couldn't shake, a fear born from years of living in a world that didn't always feel safe for people who looked like her. Her husband, Marcus Brooks, stood by the window, his broad frame casting a shadow across the room. He was dressed in a sharp suit, the kind that demanded respect without trying too hard. His tie was loose, the top button of his shirt undone, but he still carried himself with authority. Years of working as an FBI agent, no, not just an agent, the chief, had made him that way. He was a man who solved problems, who faced danger head-on and never backed down. But right now, as he looked at his wife and son, his eyes softened in a way they rarely did. "You did amazing," he said, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that could calm a room in seconds. Naomi smiled, but there was a hint of worry in her eyes. "He's perfect, isn't he?" Marcus stepped closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. "More than perfect." For the first time in months, Naomi felt like she could breathe. The pregnancy hadn't been easy. There had been complications, sleepless nights spent worrying about test results, and too many doctor's appointments to count. But now, holding her son in her arms, it all felt worth it. Marcus leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I'll be right back. I'm just going to grab a coffee. You need anything?" Naomi shook her head, her eyes never leaving the baby. "Just hurry back." Marcus nodded and stepped out of the room, his shoes clicking against the linoleum. Naomi exhaled, letting herself sink back into the pillows. She knew Marcus wouldn't be gone long, he never was. He was protective, sometimes overly so, but she loved that about him. It made her feel safe. The door opened again, and Naomi looked up, expecting to see Marcus. But it wasn't him. Instead, a man in uniform stepped inside. His badge gleamed under the harsh lights, his belt heavy with equipment. Officer Derek Callahan. She'd seen him earlier, making rounds through the hospital, but she hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, though, something about his presence made her uneasy. He was tall, with close-cropped blonde hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to pierce right through her. His posture was rigid, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Brooks?" His voice was clipped, professional. Naomi's grip on her baby tightened instinctively. "Yes. I need to ask you a few questions." Her heart skipped a beat. "Questions? About what?" "There's been a report." Her stomach dropped. "A report about what?" The officer took a step closer, his shadow falling across the bed. "About the child." Naomi blinked. "What about him?" "There's been a concern raised about custody." Her breath caught in her throat. "What?" "We need to verify that this child legally belongs to you." Naomi's pulse raced. "Legally? He's my son. I just gave birth to him hours ago." "What are you talking about?" Callahan didn't flinch. "I'm going to need you to hand him over while we sort this out." Her arms wrapped tighter around the baby, as if her body could shield him. "You're out of your mind if you think I'm giving you my child." "Ma'am, I need you to cooperate." "No. This is insane." "Who reported this?" "I can't disclose that information." Naomi's voice rose. "I don't care who reported it, this is my baby. Look at the bracelet on his ankle. Look at mine. They match." Callahan glanced at the ID bands, but his face didn't change. "That's not enough." Her voice cracked. "Not enough? What more do you need?" "I need you to hand him over." Naomi stood up, clutching her son to her chest. "You're not taking him." The officer reached for his radio. "I need backup in room 214. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Backup? Are you serious right now? You're treating me like a criminal." Callahan's hand hovered near his holster. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it needs to be." And then it happened. The door burst open, and Marcus stepped inside. His eyes immediately locked onto the scene, the trembling woman, the terrified baby, the officer standing too close, his hand too low. And that's when everything changed. But what neither of them knew, what no one in that room knew, was that this moment was only the beginning. The events that would unfold over the next few hours would expose secrets neither of them could have imagined. Secrets that would destroy careers, shatter lives, and force the truth to the surface in ways no one was prepared for. Marcus stepped forward, his broad shoulders casting a shadow across the sterile hospital room, his presence commanding attention even as the tension in the air seemed to tighten around everyone like an invisible noose. His eyes locked on Officer Callahan, sharp and unyielding, the muscles in his jaw visibly tensing as if he were holding back a tidal wave of fury. Naomi's breath was uneven, trembling, her arms wrapped protectively around the tiny bundle in her hands. Her knuckles turned white as her grip on the baby tightened, and her eyes darted anxiously between her husband and the officer standing far too close for comfort. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words felt tangled in her throat, strangled by fear and disbelief that refused to let her speak clearly. Callahan didn't flinch under Marcus's intense gaze. His shoulders squared, his expression unbothered, but there was something in the way his hand lingered just a little too close to the holster on his hip that made the hairs on the back of Naomi's neck stand up. The tension in the room thickened, pressing down on her chest, making it harder to breathe. Marcus stepped forward again, closing the distance between them, and when he spoke, his voice was low and controlled, but each syllable landed with the weight of a sledgehammer. You're going to explain yourself. Right now. Callahan's voice was clipped, rigid, as if he were speaking from a rehearsed script rather than responding naturally. Sir, I need you to step back and let me handle this situation. Handle what situation? Marcus's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and unforgiving. That's my wife. That's my child. And I don't know what the hell you think you're doing right now, but it stops. Callahan's posture stiffened, his chin lifting slightly as if he were trying to assert dominance, but Marcus didn't back down. I have reason to believe this child's custody is in question, Callahan said, each word deliberate, as though he were bracing himself for the response. I'm following protocol. Protocol? Marcus's voice rose slightly, his disbelief bleeding through the cracks of his composure. Protocol? This isn't protocol, this is a violation of her rights. Of my rights. Of this child's rights. This isn't protocol. This is abuse. Sir, I need you to calm down. Calm down. Marcus's voice was sharp enough to cut glass. Calm down. You're lucky I'm not arresting you myself right now. Naomi's voice broke through the growing argument, trembling but filled with raw emotion. He's lying. She was shaking now, tears streaming down her face. He knows he's lying. He hasn't even asked for any documents. He hasn't checked the hospital records. He just walked in here and decided to take my baby. Callahan turned his cold eyes back to her, his lips pressing into a thin line as though her words had no effect on him. I don't need your cooperation. I have the authority to act in the best interest of the child, he said, his voice colder than before. And what interest is that? Marcus demanded, stepping in closer, his voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. Ripping a newborn out of his mother's arms. Threatening her. Pulling a gun in a hospital room. Callahan's hand shifted slightly, hovering near his holster again, but this time there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Don't push me, he warned. Marcus's voice darkened. I'm not pushing you. I'm warning you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his FBI badge, flipping it open just inches from Callahan's face. The shield gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and Marcus leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of thunder. You're out of your league. For the first time, Callahan's confidence wavered. His shoulders stiffened, his hand slowly dropping away from his weapon. Marcus leaned closer. If you don't back down right now, I'll have this entire department crawling through this hospital before you can blink. Naomi's voice cracked again, this time pleading. Marcus, please. Just get him out of here. But Callahan wasn't finished. His lips curled into something resembling a sneer, though it faltered slightly. I don't care who you are, he said, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried moments earlier. This isn't about you. Marcus's eyes narrowed, his instincts firing on all cylinders now. Then who is it about? Callahan said nothing, but the flicker of panic in his eyes was unmistakable. You're not acting alone, are you? Marcus's voice was sharper now, digging for answers, refusing to let the silence win. Callahan didn't answer. The pause was long enough for Naomi's panic to deepen. She shifted nervously, her arms trembling as she held the baby tighter, as though she could shield him from the invisible threats closing in around them. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly as he typed. I'm calling in a team. Right now. Callahan's eyes darted toward the door, and for the first time, the mask of authority he'd been wearing cracked. Wait. Marcus's thumb hovered over the call button. What? You don't want to do that, Callahan said, his voice quieter now, less certain. And why is that? Callahan swallowed hard, the movement visible in his throat. Because this isn't over. Marcus's expression hardened, his thumb pressing down. No, it's not. And then, without another word, Callahan turned and walked out. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Naomi in stunned silence. Her breath was shaky, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of her chest. Marcus moved quickly to her side, dropping to his knees and gripping her shoulders gently, his voice softer but still filled with urgency. "It's okay. I'm here. I've got this." Naomi shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No. It's not okay. He's not done." Marcus met her eyes, steady but grim. "He won't touch our son again." But even as he said it, Naomi saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was scared, not of Callahan, but of what this moment meant. Marcus stood, pacing, his mind racing. He knew something wasn't right. Callahan's actions hadn't been reckless, they'd been deliberate. That scared him more than anything. He dialed quickly, his voice sharp when someone picked up. "It's me. We have a problem. Find everything you can on Derek Callahan. Now." Naomi's voice cracked. "And if it's worse than we think?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Then we fight." But Naomi didn't feel reassured. She felt like the ground beneath them was starting to crack. Marcus's phone rang again, and his expression turned stone cold. "I need you to trust me," he said. "I do," Naomi whispered. "But what if that's not enough?" Marcus didn't answer. Because deep down, they both knew, the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. The hospital corridor seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly as Marcus's footsteps echoed against the linoleum floor. His phone was still gripped tightly in his hand, his knuckles white from the pressure. Naomi's voice lingered in his head, trembling, pleading, and he could still see the fear in her eyes when he'd left her in the room with the baby. He hated leaving her, but this wasn't just about protecting their son anymore, this was about exposing whatever game Callahan was playing. And Marcus was ready to burn it all down to get to the truth. His phone buzzed again. He didn't even check the screen before answering. "What do you have?" The voice on the other end was sharp, efficient. "Derek Callahan, 20 years on the force, multiple disciplinary reports buried under administrative errors. Complaints from civilians, harassment, excessive force, but no formal charges ever stuck. Connections to a private security firm flagged for irregular activities." And, Marcus, listen to this, his name came up in an ongoing investigation into human trafficking. Marcus stopped walking. "Human trafficking? There's more. That security firm? It's suspected of operating as a front. Smuggling minors. Babies, Marcus." His grip tightened on the phone. "And Callahan? Deep ties to the company's owner. No paper trail, but there's evidence he's been moving kids out of hospitals under the radar, pretending it's for child welfare cases. We just didn't have proof, until now." Marcus's stomach churned. He glanced back toward Naomi's room, the weight of what he'd just heard pressing down on him. She had been right. This wasn't random. This wasn't protocol. Callahan wasn't here because of a misunderstanding, he was here because their son had been targeted. "Keep digging. Find me everything. I need leverage." He hung up and took a breath, forcing himself to push down the rising anger threatening to cloud his judgment. Every instinct in his body screamed to storm back to Naomi's room and rip Callahan apart, but he knew better than to let emotions lead. He needed to be smart. Precise. And he needed Callahan to make a mistake. Marcus turned the corner and froze. Callahan was at the nurse's station, leaning against the counter like he owned the place. His face was calm, but Marcus caught the tension in his shoulders, the slight twitch of his fingers as he tapped against the desk. He was nervous. "Good." Marcus moved in. "We need to talk. Now." Callahan didn't turn right away, but Marcus saw his body stiffen before he slowly faced him. "We already did," he said, but there was less certainty in his voice now. "Not here." Marcus's voice dropped, sharp and deliberate. You and I are going to have a private conversation. Unless you want this entire hospital to hear what I have to say. Callahan's jaw tightened, but after a moment, he nodded. Fine. They moved to an empty conference room down the hall. Marcus closed the door behind them, then turned to face him, his eyes locked and unrelenting. Sit down. Callahan hesitated. I said sit. Callahan pulled out a chair but didn't relax, his shoulders squared as though he was preparing for a fight. Marcus stayed standing. You've already lost, Marcus said, his voice low but lethal. I know about the trafficking. I know about the security firm. And I know exactly why you were in that room with my wife. Callahan didn't flinch, but Marcus saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. You have nothing, Callahan said. I have enough to bury you. Callahan leaned forward, his voice dropping. You think you're so untouchable, don't you? You think that badge makes you safe? Marcus stepped closer, towering over him. No. But it makes you vulnerable. Because now I'm involved. And if you don't tell me exactly what's going on, I will make it my mission to tear apart every last piece of your life until there's nothing left. Callahan's mask cracked. You don't understand. Then make me understand. Callahan's voice lowered, almost desperate. It's bigger than me. Bigger than you. You think you can stop this? You can't. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Try me. Callahan hesitated, then finally spoke. I didn't have a choice. They own me. You think I want to do this? He shook his head. I got in too deep. Debt. Bad decisions. And they knew. They always know. They made me an offer. Work for them or lose everything. And now I can't get out. Marcus's voice hardened. So you take babies from their mothers? Callahan's eyes dropped, guilt flickering across his face. It's not like that. It's not always like that. Sometimes it's, Marcus cut him off. Save it. You think that makes it better? Callahan's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. You're going to fix this, Marcus said. Right now. You're going to walk back out there and clear this up. And then you're going to help me take them down. Callahan's eyes shot up. You're crazy. You don't know what they'll do to me. You should be more worried about what I'll do to you. For the first time, Callahan looked genuinely afraid. Marcus leaned in closer. You have one chance. Take it. Callahan swallowed hard, his breathing unsteady. What do you want me to do? Marcus didn't blink. First, you're going to admit you made a mistake. Then, you're going to make sure my wife and son are safe. And after that? You're going to help me burn this whole thing to the ground. Callahan hesitated, then slowly nodded. Fine. But if this goes wrong, it won't. Marcus's voice was steady, but inside, his mind raced. He didn't trust Callahan. Not completely. But he didn't have a choice. And as they left the room, Marcus knew the storm wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the next move would decide everything. Marcus pushed through the heavy hospital doors, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the narrow frame. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed faintly, casting a cold glow over the sterile hallways. Every footstep echoed, sharp and deliberate, as if each step carried the weight of what had just unfolded. Naomi walked beside him, cradling their baby so tightly that her knuckles had turned pale. Her breathing was shallow, and her eyes darted nervously down the corridor, scanning every face as though another officer might step out at any moment and rip her child away again. Marcus could feel the tension in her every movement, and though he wanted to tell her it was over, that she was safe, he knew better. It wasn't over. Not yet. Behind them, Callahan followed like a shadow, his shoulders hunched and his eyes glued to the floor. He looked smaller than he had minutes ago, stripped of the authority he tried so hard to project. Now, he was nothing more than a man unraveling, his fear as plain as the sweat beading on his forehead. Marcus kept him close, glancing over his shoulder every few steps to make sure he didn't bolt. He wasn't about to let Callahan out of his sight, not until this was finished. Naomi's voice broke the tense silence, trembling but sharp. "Marcus, what's happening? What aren't you telling me?" Marcus kept his eyes forward, scanning the path ahead as he spoke. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" Naomi's voice cracked, and she stopped walking, forcing Marcus to turn back toward her. "My baby almost got taken from me today. A police officer tried to steal him. You're calling that complicated?" Marcus's eyes softened, but his voice remained steady. "I need you to trust me." Naomi's arms tightened protectively around the baby. "I do, Marcus. But trusting you doesn't stop me from being terrified. That man is still here. What if he tries again? What if this isn't over?" Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice but keeping it firm. "It's not over. Not yet. But I promise you, I'm going to end it." Naomi swallowed hard, tears brimming in her eyes, but she nodded. She didn't have any other choice. Callahan shifted uneasily behind them, clearing his throat. "You need to understand something." Marcus turned on him so fast that Callahan flinched. "No, you need to understand. You don't get to talk unless I tell you to. You don't get to breathe unless I say it's okay." Callahan's voice shook. "I didn't have a choice." Marcus's eyes darkened. "Don't you dare try to justify this." Callahan opened his mouth, but Naomi cut him off. "You didn't have a choice." She stepped closer, her voice rising. "You didn't have a choice. Do you know what it feels like to think someone's about to take your child? To feel that kind of fear? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Callahan's eyes dropped to the floor, but Naomi wasn't finished. "I don't care what excuse you're about to give me. You terrorized me. You terrorized my son. And I will never forgive you for that." Callahan's shoulders slumped, and Marcus stepped in again, his voice sharp. "Start talking. All of it. Now." Callahan looked up, his voice low and trembling. "They have eyes everywhere. It's not just me. It's bigger than me." Marcus's jaw clenched. "I don't care how big it is. I care about my family. And you're going to tell me exactly what I need to know to take it down." Callahan hesitated, and Marcus's voice dropped even lower. "Or I make one call, and you go down as the face of all of it." Callahan's breathing quickened. "You don't understand. If I talk, they'll come after me." Marcus stepped even closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let them try." Callahan swallowed hard, then finally started talking. "They find babies. Vulnerable babies. They watch the mothers, single moms, teenage moms, women without families or support. They target them because no one questions it when the babies disappear. They make it look legal, like welfare checks or custody disputes." Naomi's voice broke. "How many?" Callahan hesitated. "I don't know." "How many?" "Too many." Marcus's voice cut in sharply. "And you helped them?" Callahan flinched. "I didn't have a choice." Marcus grabbed him by the collar, shoving him back against the wall. "You keep saying that like it's supposed to mean something. Like it's supposed to make it better. You think any of this is forgivable?" Callahan's voice cracked. "You don't understand what they're capable of." Marcus let him go, his hands shaking. "Then you better pray I stop them before they come for you." Suddenly, Marcus's phone buzzed, and he grabbed it quickly, stepping away from Naomi and Callahan as he answered. "Talk to me." The voice on the other end was urgent. "We've got everything. Files, communications, financial records. It's huge, Marcus. Hospitals, adoption agencies, law enforcement, they're all tied in. This isn't just trafficking. It's a pipeline. And Callahan's in the middle of it. Marcus's stomach dropped, but his voice stayed steady. Get me everything. Now. He hung up and turned back to the others, his eyes locking on Callahan. You're done hiding. You're going to help me take them down, and if you even think about backing out, I'll make sure you're the first name on every file. Callahan's face was pale, but he nodded. Naomi stepped closer to Marcus, her voice trembling. What happens now? Marcus's voice softened just enough for her to hear the promise in it. Now. We fight. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but this time there was something else in them, something stronger. Determination. Callahan shifted nervously. What if this goes wrong? Marcus didn't even blink. Then I make sure it's the last mistake they ever make. The weight of his words hung in the air as they moved toward the exit, their steps heavy with purpose. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. And Marcus was ready to face whatever came next. Marcus gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as the car sped through the dimly lit streets. The glow of passing streetlights reflected off the windshield, flickering across his face and highlighting the tension etched into his features. His jaw was set, his breathing steady but shallow, and his mind raced with 1,000 calculations. Every turn of the wheel, every glance at the rearview mirror, every flicker of a shadow felt like another moment closer to either resolution or disaster. In the back seat, Naomi sat hunched over, clutching their baby so tightly that the fabric of the blanket he was wrapped in was beginning to bunch up beneath her fingers. Her heart pounded so loudly she swore it could be heard in the silence that filled the car. She kept looking out the windows, her eyes scanning the darkness for headlights or figures that might be following them. She could still feel the weight of Callahan's earlier words echoing in her head, the fear, the desperation in his voice when he said they wouldn't stop, that they'd come after her, after Marcus, after their child. Her arms tightened around her son, and she leaned down to press a kiss against his soft forehead, silently promising him that no one would take him from her. Not now. Not ever. Callahan sat stiffly in the front passenger seat, his shoulders hunched and his hands resting on his knees, his fingers twitching nervously. He kept glancing over at Marcus, but Marcus didn't acknowledge him. His focus was locked on the road, his eyes scanning for threats, his body coiled like a spring, ready to react at the first sign of danger. Callahan finally broke the silence, his voice trembling. I don't think this is going to work. Marcus didn't even look at him. It's going to work. Callahan shook his head. You don't get it. These people, this isn't just some gang or small-time operation. They've got connections, real power. They've got people everywhere. You don't know who you can trust. Marcus's voice was sharp. I don't need to trust anyone. I just need them to make one mistake. Callahan's voice cracked. And what if they don't? What if they see right through this? Marcus finally turned, his eyes locking onto Callahan with a look so intense it made him flinch. Then you'd better pray they don't. Naomi's voice rose from the back, sharp and trembling. Enough. Both of you. She leaned forward, her eyes filled with fear and anger. My baby is back here. My son. You two can argue about who's in control later, but right now, you both need to focus and make sure that we get out of this alive. Marcus's expression softened as he looked at her through the mirror, but his voice stayed firm. We will. Naomi shook her head. Don't promise me things you can't guarantee, Marcus. I need the truth. Marcus exhaled slowly. The truth is I won't let anything happen to you. Or him. Callahan shifted nervously, his voice quieter now. You don't know what you're walking into. Marcus's eyes flicked to him. And you do. Callahan hesitated before nodding. I know how they operate. I know how they test you, how they watch every move you make before deciding whether you're a problem. Marcus leaned in slightly, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. Good. Then you'll help us give them something to see. Callahan swallowed hard, his breathing uneven. And if it doesn't work? Marcus didn't blink. Then we make it work. The car slowed as Marcus pulled into an empty parking lot behind a rundown warehouse, the building's windows dark and broken, its brick walls streaked with grime. Naomi shivered as she stared at it, her stomach twisting. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but she knew better. It wasn't empty. She could feel it in her bones. Marcus turned off the engine and faced Callahan. Get out. Callahan hesitated. Now. Callahan opened the door and stepped out, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for his phone. Marcus opened his door and followed, motioning for Naomi to stay put. She shook her head, her voice trembling. Marcus, no. Don't leave me here. You're safer in the car. Keep the doors locked. Don't open them for anyone but me. Naomi's voice cracked. And what if you don't come back? Marcus knelt beside the open door, his eyes meeting hers. I will. She swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with tears, but she nodded. Marcus stood and closed the door before turning back to Callahan. Make the call. Callahan's fingers trembled as he dialed. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered. It was low and sharp, the kind of voice that sent chills down Naomi's spine even though she couldn't hear the words. Callahan spoke quietly, his voice strained but steady enough to convince whoever was on the other end. He set the meeting, confirming the time and location before hanging up and shoving the phone back into his pocket. Marcus stepped closer. What did they say? They're on their way. Marcus's eyes didn't waver. How many? Callahan swallowed. I don't know. More than one. Maybe 3. Maybe more. Marcus didn't flinch. Then we're ready. Callahan's voice cracked again. You're not ready for this. Marcus leaned in, his voice low but deadly. The only thing I'm not ready for is letting them get away with this. Naomi watched through the window, her heart pounding as Marcus and Callahan moved toward the warehouse. The baby stirred in her arms, and she rocked him gently, whispering soft reassurances even as her own fear threatened to swallow her whole. She wanted to scream, to run after Marcus and beg him not to do this, but she knew better. She knew Marcus. He wouldn't stop, not until it was over. As the warehouse door creaked open and the darkness swallowed them, Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She pressed her forehead against the glass, her heart racing as she whispered a prayer she wasn't sure anyone would hear. Please, Marcus. Come back to me. Marcus's footsteps echoed against the cracked concrete floor as he followed Callahan deeper into the warehouse, the air thick with dust and a faint smell of oil and rust. The dim light from the single bulb overhead barely cut through the shadows, casting long, distorted shapes along the walls. Marcus's eyes darted to every corner, every shadow, cataloging exits and possible threats. Callahan moved slower, his shoulders hunched, his breath shallow, and Marcus could feel the man's fear radiating off him like heat. He didn't trust him, not completely, but right now, he needed him. Callahan's voice broke the heavy silence, low and shaky. They'll be here soon. Marcus didn't look at him. Good. Callahan's hands twitched at his sides. You're too calm. You don't get it. They don't play fair. Marcus finally turned, his eyes sharp. Neither do I. Callahan flinched and looked away, his voice dropping to a whisper. If they figure out what we're doing, we're dead. Marcus stepped closer, his voice even but heavy with threat. If they figure out what we're doing, you're dead. Callahan swallowed hard and nodded, his gaze flicking toward the entrance. The sound of tires crunching gravel outside sent a jolt through his body, and he wiped his sweaty palms on his pants. "They're here." Marcus didn't move. "Good. Let's give them a show." The door creaked open, and 3 men stepped inside. The leader was tall, his dark suit crisp and tailored, completely out of place in the grimy surroundings. The other 2 flanked him, broader, bulkier, their movements calculated and predatory. The leader's eyes locked onto Callahan first, his lips curling into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Callahan. I was starting to think you lost your nerve." Callahan's voice wavered. "I told you I'd deliver." The man's eyes shifted to Marcus, sharp and assessing. "And who's this?" Marcus stepped forward before Callahan could answer, his tone flat but commanding. "I'm the insurance policy." The man's smirk widened slightly. "Insurance?" Callahan jumped in quickly, his voice trembling. "He's a fixer. Someone to make sure things go smoothly." The man's eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus. "And why would I need that?" Marcus didn't blink. "Because things have been messy lately." The man let out a low chuckle. "Messy? That's one way to put it." Marcus took another step forward, closing the distance. "Let's not waste time. You wanted results. I'm here to make sure you get them." The man's eyes flicked between Marcus and Callahan, suspicion brewing just beneath the surface. Callahan shifted nervously, and Marcus felt it, the moment when the balance tipped, when the tension hit its breaking point. The man's smirk faded, and his voice dropped. "I don't know who you think you're fooling, but this doesn't feel right." Callahan's voice cracked. "It's fine. The man cut him off, his hand raising slightly, and the 2 men behind him shifted, their postures hardening. Marcus didn't wait. He moved first, his hand shooting out to grab Callahan's collar and shove him toward the group. Callahan stumbled, his eyes wide with panic. "He's yours." Marcus's voice was sharp. "Take him." Callahan spun back to Marcus, his voice desperate. "What?" "No, wait," Marcus didn't flinch. "You wanted to save yourself, didn't you?" Callahan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The leader's eyes lit up with interest. "Now that's more like it." Marcus stepped back, keeping his expression cold even as Callahan looked at him with a mixture of betrayal and terror. It was a gamble, a dangerous one, but Marcus needed time. He needed answers, and Callahan had to sell this. The leader motioned to his men, and they grabbed Callahan, shoving him toward the far wall. Marcus kept his hands loose at his sides, his breathing steady, but his pulse hammered in his ears. He needed to keep them focused on Callahan long enough to figure out their next move. Callahan's voice broke. "Wait, please, you said you'd help me." Marcus didn't respond. Instead, he looked at the leader, his voice sharp. "You have what you wanted. Now let's talk about what I want." The man raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Marcus leaned in slightly. "I want names." The leader chuckled, shaking his head. "Names? You think we give those out?" Marcus's voice dropped. "I think you don't have a choice." The leader's smile faded, and the room shifted again. The tension thickened, the air growing heavy as one of the men stepped closer to Marcus. "You're in over your head." Marcus didn't move. "No. You are." The man's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, Marcus's phone buzzed. He didn't look at it. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled it out, and tossed it onto the floor in front of them. The screen lit up with a video feed, live footage of another location. A warehouse, filled with crates, men moving quickly, and a team of agents swarming inside. The leader's face paled. "What the hell is this?" Marcus's voice was razor-sharp. "Insurance." The leader stepped closer, his voice dropping to a growl. "You have no idea what you've done." Marcus's eyes didn't waver. "I know exactly what I've done. The leader lunged, but Marcus was faster, his hand already on his weapon as he aimed it straight at the man's chest. Don't. The room froze. The two men behind the leader hesitated, their hands twitching toward their weapons, but Marcus didn't flinch. His voice stayed steady, cutting through the tension like a blade. You're done. The leader's voice was quieter now, but it carried a sharp edge. You think this ends with me? Marcus didn't blink. No. But it starts with you. The leader's eyes darkened, but he didn't move. Marcus took a step closer, pressing the barrel of his gun just enough to make his point. You're going to call them off. All of them. And you're going to make sure no one ever touches my family again. The leader's voice dropped to a whisper. Or what? Marcus's eyes locked onto his. Or I burn it all down. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before the leader finally nodded. Marcus didn't lower his weapon, not until the men stepped back and Callahan dropped to his knees, gasping for breath. As Marcus turned and motioned for Callahan to follow, the leader's voice echoed behind him. This isn't over. Marcus didn't look back. It never is. Marcus didn't loosen his grip on the gun even as the leader and his men stepped back, their movements slow and calculated, like wolves deciding whether to retreat or pounce. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating, and Marcus could feel the weight of every second stretching longer than it should. His heart pounded, but his breathing remained steady, controlled. He couldn't afford to let them see any hesitation. One wrong move, and the fragile thread holding this moment together would snap. He stepped back, his eyes never leaving the leaders, the gun still raised as he motioned for Callahan to move. Callahan scrambled to his feet, his breaths loud and uneven, but Marcus didn't acknowledge him. His focus was locked on the men in front of him, reading their body language, searching for the first sign of an attack. The leader's voice cut through the silence, low and sharp. You don't walk out of here alive, FBI. Not after this. Marcus's voice came back just as sharp, just as certain. Watch me. The leader smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. You think you've won something here? You think one move against us changes anything? Marcus took another step back, inching toward the exit while keeping his aim steady. I don't need to change everything. I just need to end this. The leader's eyes narrowed, his hands curling into fists at his sides. You're playing with fire. Marcus's tone dropped, his voice colder now. Then let it burn. Callahan stumbled as they moved toward the door, his panic rising with every step. He kept looking back, his breath hitching every time one of the men shifted even slightly. Marcus reached the door and pushed it open, never breaking eye contact with the leader until they were outside and the door swung shut behind them. Only then did he finally lower his gun, his chest heaving as the adrenaline began to wear off. He turned to Callahan, his voice sharp. Get in the car. Callahan hesitated, his hands shaking. What now? Marcus grabbed him by the arm, shoving him toward the vehicle. Now we finish this. Callahan slid into the passenger seat without another word, and Marcus climbed in behind the wheel. Naomi's eyes were wide when he looked back at her, her voice trembling. What happened? Marcus didn't answer right away. He reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly before speaking. It's not over yet, but we're close. Her voice cracked. Marcus, what does that mean? What's going to happen? It means we need to move fast. Naomi's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, holding the baby closer. Marcus turned the key, and the engine roared to life. The car sped out of the lot, tires screeching as Marcus merged onto the highway, his mind already running through the next steps. Callahan shifted nervously in the seat beside him, his voice barely above a whisper. They're going to come after us. Marcus's voice was flat. Let them. Callahan's breath hitched. You don't understand what they're capable of. Marcus's eyes flicked toward him briefly. Then explain it to me. Callahan hesitated, his hands fidgeting in his lap. They don't leave loose ends. Ever. If they think you're a threat, they won't stop. They'll keep coming until, Marcus cut him off. Until what? Until they win. Not this time. Callahan's voice cracked. You don't know them like I do. And you don't know me. Naomi's voice broke through the tension, softer but no less urgent. Marcus, please. I need to know we're safe. Marcus's voice softened as he glanced at her in the rearview mirror. We will be. But Naomi shook her head, her voice rising. I can't keep doing this, Marcus. I can't keep waiting for the next threat, the next attack. I need this to end. Marcus's grip tightened on the wheel. It will. Callahan let out a sharp breath. You keep saying that like it's a guarantee, but it's not. You're risking everything. Marcus's voice turned sharp again. And you risked lives. Innocent lives. So don't sit there and preach to me about what I'm risking. Callahan flinched but didn't argue. The baby stirred in Naomi's arms, and she rocked him gently, whispering soft reassurances even as her own fear lingered just beneath the surface. She could feel the weight of everything pressing down on her, the fear, the exhaustion, the anger, and it was almost too much. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the images kept coming. Callahan's face as he reached for her child. The sound of Marcus's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the chaos. The look in the leader's eyes as he threatened them. It was all too much. Marcus's phone buzzed, and he answered quickly, his voice low and urgent. Tell me. The voice on the other end spoke fast. We've got them. Full sweep. The operation's shutting down. But Marcus, they're already moving to cover their tracks. Marcus's jaw tightened. How long? Not long. You need to get out now. Marcus hung up and pressed harder on the gas, his voice sharp. We need to move. Now. Callahan's voice cracked. What did they say? Marcus didn't answer, his focus locked on the road. Naomi's voice trembled. Marcus? Marcus's tone softened just enough to steady her. They're shutting it down, but we're not out yet. Naomi's breath caught. And if we don't get out? Marcus's eyes didn't leave the road. We will. The car sped down the highway, the lights of the city blurring past them. Marcus's mind raced, calculating their next steps. He knew they were running out of time. He knew the people they were dealing with wouldn't go down quietly. But he also knew one thing for certain, he wasn't going to stop until his family was safe. Callahan shifted nervously again, his voice breaking the silence. I can't go back. Marcus didn't look at him. Then don't. Callahan swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. What if it's not enough? Marcus's voice was steady. Then we make it enough. Naomi's voice rose from the back, soft but determined. We're not letting them win. Marcus glanced at her in the mirror, and for the first time that night, a flicker of hope broke through the tension. No, we're not. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel as the car cut through the dark streets, headlights carving out narrow paths in the night. His eyes flicked between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, scanning for anyone following them, but all he saw was darkness. Beside him, Callahan sat stiffly, his breath shallow and uneven, his shoulders twitching like he was bracing for something to go wrong. In the back seat, Naomi held their baby close, whispering softly to calm him, but her own fear was evident in the slight tremble of her voice. Marcus couldn't let himself think about the weight of what had just happened or the danger still lingering around them. He had to stay sharp, focused. Callahan finally broke the silence, his voice low and hoarse. Where are we going? Marcus didn't look at him. Somewhere safe. Callahan's fingers drummed nervously on his knee. There's no such thing anymore. Not for me. Marcus's voice cut through the tension. That's not my problem. You're the one who let it get this far. Callahan turned toward him, his voice sharper now. I didn't have a choice. Marcus's eyes snapped to him, his voice dropping to a dangerous tone. Stop saying that. You always had a choice. You just didn't like the consequences. Callahan fell silent, turning his face toward the window. Marcus focused back on the road, but his mind raced. He knew Callahan was scared, but he also knew fear wasn't enough to excuse what he'd done. The lives he'd ruined couldn't be undone. Marcus wasn't looking for redemption, he was looking for accountability. Naomi's voice rose from the back, quieter but steady. Marcus, what happens when this is over? Marcus's grip on the wheel tightened. It doesn't end tonight. Her voice cracked. But it has to. Marcus's eyes softened for the first time, meeting hers in the mirror. It will. The car pulled into the lot of a small motel off the highway, its flickering neon sign barely lighting the parking lot. Marcus shut off the engine and turned to Callahan. Get out. Callahan hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of his seat. And then what? Marcus stepped out of the car, leaning in through Callahan's open door. Then you make the call. You give them everything. And if you try to run, I'll find you before they do. Callahan's face paled, but he nodded, climbing out of the car as Marcus pulled out his phone and handed it to him. Make it quick. Naomi waited in the back seat, her eyes never leaving Marcus. The baby stirred, and she rocked him gently, but her attention stayed fixed on Marcus as Callahan stepped away to make the call. Her voice trembled, but there was steel beneath it. Do you trust him? Marcus shook his head. No. Naomi's breath caught, but she didn't argue. Marcus leaned into the car, resting a hand on her knee. But I trust us. Callahan returned a few minutes later, his face pale and his hands shaking. It's done. They're expecting me to deliver more kids tomorrow. Marcus's jaw tightened. Not anymore. Callahan flinched. What are you going to do? Marcus's voice was sharp. End it. Callahan's eyes widened. You don't get it. You take them down, and more will take their place. Marcus stepped closer, his voice like steel. Then we'll take them down too. Callahan looked like he wanted to argue, but Marcus didn't give him the chance. He turned back to Naomi, motioning for her to get out of the car. She hesitated, clutching the baby, but Marcus's steady gaze gave her the strength to move. Inside the motel room, the tension didn't ease. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, rocking their son while Marcus paced the small space, his phone pressed to his ear as he made one call after another, setting plans in motion. Callahan sat against the wall, his head in his hands, muttering to himself. Naomi's voice broke through the noise, trembling but firm. Marcus, what if this doesn't work? Marcus stopped, turning to face her. Then we make it work. Hours passed in a blur of phone calls and tense silences until finally, Marcus's phone buzzed one last time. He answered, listening intently before hanging up and turning to Naomi. It's over. Her breath caught. Over. Marcus nodded. The FBI raided their operations. They have everything, files, evidence, names. They're done. Naomi's tears fell freely as she clutched their baby, sobbing softly into his blanket. Marcus sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as the weight of it all hit them at once. Callahan sat frozen, staring blankly at the wall. Naomi's voice broke through the silence. What happens to him? Marcus looked at Callahan, his voice flat. He'll testify. And then he'll pay for what he did. Callahan didn't argue. He just nodded, his shoulders slumping as if he already knew his fate. The days that followed were a whirlwind of arrests, press conferences, and investigations. Marcus was hailed as a hero, but he didn't feel like one. All he felt was relief that Naomi and their son were safe. Callahan's testimony brought down the entire operation, exposing a network that had operated in the shadows for years. But it didn't make up for the lives that had been destroyed. Naomi finally smiled again, holding their baby as Marcus stood beside her, his arm around her waist. They had survived. They had fought back. And now, they were free. This story isn't just about corruption. It's about choices. The choices we make when we're pushed to the edge. The ones we justify to ourselves because we're afraid of what will happen if we don't. But fear doesn't excuse wrongdoing. Fear doesn't erase consequences. So ask yourself, what would you do if someone you loved was threatened? How far would you go to protect them? And at what cost? Thank you for joining us for this story. If it made you think, if it made you feel something, let us know in the comments. Share your thoughts and tell us what you would have done if you were in Marcus's shoes. And don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories like this one, stories that challenge, inspire, and leave you questioning what you thought you knew. Hit the like button, share this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.